It's Roger's personal Geiger counter. It just proves that we live on a radioactive planet and that radiation treatment at times is just not too bad for you. So welcome, I'm Liz Kenny. I'm a very proud radiation oncologist. Thank you. I'm very proud to be part of Cancer Care Services at the Royal Brisbane, very proud to be a radiation oncologist. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you this evening. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, the Turrbal people, acknowledge their elders past and present and future. We're delighted this evening to have two very prominent guest speakers, very prominent members of radiation oncology community, not just here but across the country, Roger Allison and Bob Fitchew. They're actually part of the history of this place. Welcome, of course, to our board members who are here, our members of Cancer Care Services at the Royal and Radiation Oncology in particular. I think we have apologies from Alana Geary and Rob Stable this evening. I'd also love to acknowledge Bruce Jones, who's the director of QBank and a major sponsor of the Royal Brisbane alumni. And we'll also acknowledge our bronze sponsor, Pert & Associates. We are thrilled that you support the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital alumni. And evenings like this are actually really important. It's not until you go through the history of, for example, radiation oncology, and actually what a glorious history it is, and realise how pertinent that has been on this site and what a leader nationally and internationally this hospital has been through the decades, actually since the year before I was born. So that's a lot of decades. So without too much further ado, I'm going to introduce Roger Allison, and both of our speakers tonight are two of not just my favourite people, but two of the most modest men that I know. So when you look at the tiny, tiny blurb that's in under Roger Allison's guest speakers, it doesn't really begin to tell you anything about Roger. Roger is a national prominent radiation oncologist, and specialties in breast, neuro, and of course thyroid. He's probably one of the world's most experienced thyroid cancer physicians across this country and internationally. He actually did all of his training overseas, and initially, and had exposure to oncology in Bath, and then did his pathology, did his physician's training in Birmingham, and then went and actually practiced and trained in oncology in Edinburgh. So Roger and his lovely family came to Brisbane for a working holiday for maybe a year or two in 1977 and never went home. He was director of Cancer Care Services here for 20 years, the boss to die for, as I used to introduce him. And of course, Roger's played a very important part in our history across Australia and New Zealand. He's been the Dean of the Faculty of Radiation Oncology and has been awarded the Röntgen Medal by our college, which is an exceedingly high honour indeed. So I'm going to hand you over to Roger. I think he's taken his personal Geiger counter away so as not to distract you. But welcome, Roger.
Thank you very much, Liz. Thank you all for coming. It's a rather bleak evening. Thanks to the Alumni Committee. And thanks particularly to Amy Henderson, who's put up with our constant slide changing and general flapping about. So thank you, Amy, very much indeed. And thanks to the sponsors again. I'm going to speak about the evolution of radiation therapy, a bit of a history, and try and weave into it some local and Royal Brisbane history. I worked out that Bob and I have clocked up 89 years in service of the Royal Brisbane together. So I don't know what that says. And there's so much material, I'll have to apologise if I've left people out who somebody feels they should have been included. Anyway, let's go. We've subtitled this Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. And I'm going to talk about the methodology, the applications, and a little bit about the future. Let's go back in the TARDIS to 1895, and that was the year the Queensland National Art Gallery opened. The first Edison motion pictures were shown in the Brisbane Exhibition Building, and what's more, the world premiere performance of Waltzing Matilda in the North Gregory Hotel in winter. So that was a golden year. And the superintendent, or the CEO of the hospital, was the very notable Ernest Sanford Jackson. And he was a huge benefactor in various ways. He set up nursing funds and was a very noble fellow. Plus ça change, this is looking at the average cost per hospital bed day in 1896, and you can see that in Melbourne the cost was £80, 1 shilling and threepence, whereas in Brisbane we did it much more efficiently on £63, 8 shillings and 5 pence. So I think those relativities probably pertain right to this very day. So I'm sure our bosses will be very keen to know that. Now, going straight back to a small town in Germany, Würzburg. Würzburg is in Bavaria. It's the headquarters of the Franconian wine growing industry. And unlike most German wines, it's not Riesling, it's Silvaner and Müller-Thurgau, for those who are interested. So Wilhelm was a professor of physics. He actually only published 3 papers on radiation. He published a whole lot of other papers on electricity. And he, on the 8th of November, 1895, found that some of his plates were glowing in the dark. So he came home, and you can imagine the scene. He came home to his loving wife, Bertha, and said, I found this new ray. Would you like to have your hand x-rayed? And to her eternal credit, rather than saying, get lost, she agreed to. And for 15 minutes, her hand was in the ray. And this produced this absolute stunner of an X-ray. And this has been the most sort of influential X-ray all over the last 125 years. So this is Bertha Röntgen's hand X-rays. And then there were different types of rays. There was hard X-rays, medium soft, and soft X-rays, all illustrating different properties. The thing which staggers me still is that the way this knowledge was disseminated all around the world. I mean, there was no internet, no email, no fax, hardly any telephones, and yet, as you'll see in the next few slides, the knowledge of this was whizzed around the world. And this was in July 1896. So he discovered the X-rays on the 8th of November. He delivered the paper at the end of December. It was published immediately. And in mid-February 1896, the first X-ray was taken in Australia by somebody in Newcastle. And by October, somebody was using radiation to try and treat larynx cancer. I mean, that's just staggering. It just doesn't happen this way these days. And this is an X-ray from 1896 of a hand of a leper, showing the deformities so this was 10 months after the discovery of X-rays. This is another thing. This is Walter Nisbet, who's a famous person in our college. This is his X-ray equipment. This picture, I'm sorry it's not a very good picture, but it's come out. This was the X-ray equipment that was bought by James Main and installed in this hospital in June 1896. And it was bequeathed, it cost £400, which was a considerable amount of money in those days, and it was bequeathed by James Main to the hospital, and he was an enormous benefactor, as you know. So this sort of thing, there was wondrous X-rays. see through a block of wood, count the coins within your purse, admission threepence, open all day. And it's good to see that the Southport Social Photographic Club was at the Temperance Institute, so I'm very pleased to see that was happening then. So a high moral ground in all this. The next person on the scene was Henri Becquerel, who was in Paris, and he discovered spontaneous radioactivity. So what you've been listening to is a combination of the terrestrial radiation and celestial radiation. And that's what we've been exposed to, and human life has evolved against a background of radiation. And now here comes my favourite person, and when I said standing on the shoulders of giants, it maybe should have giantesses as well. This is Marie Curie, and there's a number of photographs of her in her lab. She's recently been voted the most influential woman in history by the BBC History Society. They had a poll of various people, and she, quite rightly, I think, came out on top. I can show you a bit more detail later. And she was the first person, and I stress person, to win 2 Nobel Prizes. The first was in 1903 for discovering radium and polonium. She shared that with her husband, and the second, she discovered radium. Now, this is another photograph. This is an Australian one. This is at the Royal Melbourne in 1905 with people having various skin lesions treated. It's the first example I could find of group therapy, and I think it's a very important thing to say. This is in my alma mater at the London Hospital. This is, in fact, people are very keen on rays. This is children being treated with ultraviolet rays to improve their general well-being, because London was full of smog-filled, vitamin D deficient children in those days. And it says here, nothing like perseverance. That's good Calvinistic stuff. Now, almost immediately, the discovery of radium, it was used to treat cancer. So we're looking at radium, first cure, acknowledged in Sweden, of a skin cancer on the nose in 1899. And I'll talk a bit about larynx cancer later. And then only later did fractionation come, when it realized that the harm that was capable of being inflicted by radiation. And here's another example in the 20s of a sort of very primitive X-ray machine. And this is a film taken in 1905 of treating breast cancer, a film in a hospital in Paris. And a lot of things were happening at that time, and in 1905 this young chap produced his famous equation about relativity. So the science was hot to trot in those days. So just a little bit about what we're talking about. This is the electronic spectrum, and we're talking about X and gamma rays, which are at the high end of this. With increasing frequency, decreasing wavelength, and increasing energy, this is the bit that causes the biological effect. Your mobile phone's down here, so it might scramble your brain intellectually, but it won't give you cancer. So you're all right. It's only when you get past the ultraviolet light that you will start getting a biological effect. And just to give you a bit of science, although Bob's going to tell you all about this, what does the work is the fast electrons knocking out and ionizing, and these ions are unstable and are reactive, and they do the biological damage. And the cell killing is not immediate, and I think some people, and often it's difficult to explain this to patients, the cell killing is done by interfering with the genetic and reproducibility makeup of each cancer cell. And so we get sometimes a delayed response. And I think it's important that we recognize this. And this was responsible for a lot of the early troubles that were caused in the early days. I put this up, that this is when fractionation came in, and it could only be discovered by some crazy French scientists. They discovered that you could sterilize a ram by giving him fractionated radiation therapy without causing necrosis to the scrotum. So this is one of the early radiobiological experiments. And as I say, only a French person could have done that. So the other thing that's bedeviled us over the years is that cancer treatments are non-specific, and cancer treatments damage normal tissue. I'm about to show the one horrible photograph I'm going to show, so if you want to close your eyes, you can. This is one of the first patients I was given when I first came here in 1977, a man with a very nasty cancer of the lip. The surgeons didn't want a bar of him. And this was taken on the 29th of June, 1977. This is the radiation field here. And this is the result on the 2nd of October. Now, I put this up for two reasons. One is to show that the cancer is cured, but also to show that the normal tissue is also affected. And it's not possible to treat cancer and retain the organ without causing some degree of damage to the normal tissue. And this is the beauty of radiation treatment. We can treat areas and retain their function, albeit in a slightly damaged fashion. So you see here the tissues are thin. There's obviously damage caused by the tumour itself, but there's been good healing. This was a functional result. He was able to eat and was free of pain. But there was this. And so what has governed our lives over the last century is this graph, and this is tumour control against dose. And what this shows, if you don't give enough dose, you won't cure anybody. If you don't get past a certain threshold, you won't cure anybody. But you will start getting, on this other curve, tissue damage. And our job is to pull these two curves apart. Sometimes things work for us, and this is where there's a big gap. And there are some cancers like lymphomas or seminomas of the testis where this is easy to do. We can treat great big areas. Sometimes the reverse is the case, and this would be a classic thing like a glioblastoma of the brain. Unfortunately, we can't give a dose which will cure the tumour and spare the brain. So, and this is the ultimate sort of, if you like, toxicity. We irradiate people to condition them for bone marrow transplants. And so we knock out their residual leukemia and we knock out their own marrow. And that would prove fatal were they not rescued by the donor marrow. So that's an extreme example of the toxicity given. So again, a low therapeutic ratio. The acute reacting tissues are skin, the gut, mucous membranes, but the later and somehow more important are the connective tissues and the vascular tissues. So we've got to be careful of both of these. And the other thing is that the adverse effects may not be manifest for several years, and this led the early pioneers into a lot of trouble because they didn't get much acute reaction, and then they got a lot of late reaction. So our problem is to balance the dose against the volume, the overall time, and the dose per day or fraction, and avoiding sensitive structures. And that's what our life is spent trying to do, and all the equipment we use is trying to help that. Now, if you look at this cursorily, you'll see that there is a difference, but just think what the difference is, and you think, well, perhaps not very much. But when you, and because we're used to looking at things in two dimensions, all our mobile phones, our computer screens are just two-dimensional. When you translate that into volumes in the body, this is in fact, that last one is a ratio of 8 to 10, but this in volumetric terms is double, 512 to 1,000. So it makes a huge difference if we think in 3D rather than just 2D. And this is looking at radiobiology. Some tumours are radiosensitive, but not necessarily curable. And what we're interested in is curability. In planning and prescribing radiation, we're asked to distinguish between cure and palliation. And it strikes us sometimes that many other disciplines would be quite usefully exercised to consider that. So that's what we're asked to do when we write a prescription for radiation. And here's a quote from Ralston Patterson, who I will allude to later on, but this wasn't some modern palliative care guru. This was a radiation oncologist writing in 1947 that before embarking, the cost should be counted from the patient's standpoint, the chief criterion being that the after history of that patient should be less distressing than it would have been had the patient been left alone. It's pretty smart thinking. And as Liz has said, this is a quote from Liz, the holy grail of radiation is to maximally treat cancer tissue and maximally spare normal tissue. So let's look at the orthovoltage era, which extended from the 20s to about the 50s. This was plagued by limited depth dose, difficult to treat deep structures, a large dose to the skin, and a large dose to the bone. So what was happening in Brisbane then? Well, the Radiological Society of the BMA, British Medical Association of Queensland, was founded in early 1930. It included Dr. Burnett Clark, Dr. William Hislop, and I'm pleased to say that Dr. Hislop's son, William, is here this evening, so welcome. James Ray and Ian Wilkie has given me some knowledge about this. Dr. Lockhart Spence and Dr. Valentine McDowell. And this is clearly a very energetic group. This is a picture of Valentine McDowell. He was not only an aviator and a doctor, and he ran one of Brisbane's first radio stations. And looking at this, he found radium to be very successful, and he treated a lot of squamous cancer from 1929 to June 1933. This is his figures. He took trouble to work out all the data. And this is a 60% cure rate of SCCs, and you can imagine what some of them are like. This is a cure rate of 70% for BCCs. And he's been honoured by having a park named in his name up at Bridgeman Downs. So if you're passing that way, you can go to Valentine McDowell Park. And this is from John Pern's book, and I'll allude to that a bit later on. This was the other trouble that plagued our earlier pioneers in radiation treatment, because their hands were always within the radon and radium field, and many of them lost their fingers and hands. And this is a plaque at the London hospital where I trained to the early radiation martyrs who lost their lives through radiation damage. We mentioned Burnett Clark, and he was a pioneering radiologist and radiotherapist, and he was one of the founders of the Queensland Trust, which later became the QRI. He signed up for war service, and he was a prisoner of war in Changi from 42 to 45, and I'll allude to that later on. And if you haven't read his diary of that time called Behind the Wire, there's a copy of it on the desk there. It's a very moving account of all the privations and the things he tried to do to help people in Changi. And he sadly died of radiation-induced cancers on the hand, which had spread to the lymph nodes, and he died in 1974. But he was one of the pioneers of Queensland radiation oncology. And he gave the 1969 Jackson Lecture, and clearly he was very moved by this, because he was saying today one never sees the dreadful ravages of skin cancer such was seen in the 1920s and 30s, and many other diseases, and with progress there's still much to learn. So this is an early ultra-voltage machine, and this is David Walker, who was one of our pioneer physicists, and I'll talk about him a little bit later on. This is the sort of treatment, this is treating cancer of the ethmoid with fixed fields, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. The next thing to say is that we look at brachytherapy, which means close-up therapy. And brachytherapy is practiced inserting radium into virtually every orifice and cavity and facility that you could. We had a radon gas facility at the QRI. Direct loading became replaced with afterloading, but it became routine part of cure for many patients. This unlikely looking set of gear, which looks as if you might have picked it up from Bunnings, is in fact responsible for the cure of cancer of the cervix in hundreds and thousands of people around the world. This is a radium tube which went into the uterus, and these are two so-called radium ovoids which were spaced around the cervix. And this alone, over several applications, could cure localized cancer of the cervix. And here it's shown in position in the uterus. And as I say, this was practiced from the early 20s, in the days when there were no antibiotics, no anesthesia, fairly crude. This is a very sad tale. We talked about preserving function, and laryngeal cancer was obviously one of the highly useful things that radiation was used for. This is the sad case of Giacomo Puccini, who was a very keen smoker, and as he was in the throes of composing Turandot, he developed laryngeal cancer and was very distressed and coughing up blood. He went to Dr. Lutois in Brussels and initially had some external radiation, which relieved his hemoptysis and improved things. And then they attempted to insert some radium needles, but he got worse and then sadly died of a heart attack. And Arturo Toscanini conducted the opening of Turandot in 1926. So that's a sad reminder of somebody who's written all these wonderful arias, and he must have been composing Nessun Dorma as he was developing this dreadful laryngeal cancer. So the next thing that happened locally was in 1943, the government of New South Wales got Ralston Patterson out. He was the director of the Christie Hospital and the Holt Radium Institute. He visited Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, and this led to the foundation of the Queensland Radium Institute in 1944 and the Peter Mac in 1949. The Sydney people didn't take his advice and insisted on having a small radiotherapy centre in Everett. They're one of their teaching hospitals, and that's bedeviled them ever since in my view. But it led to a lot of things. Now, I put this up. This is Vina White, who is in fact now Vina Pern, and I put this up because this was taken in the 1950s to speak about radiation therapists, and they're a very important part of our team. This was a demonstration which was in town, and they're the ones who translate our plans into reality and do the treatments each day. It's a highly complex task. It's a mixture of mathematics, physiotherapy, social work, nursing, and intellectual activity. So we're very dependent, and the team is the radiation therapist, the radiation oncologist, and the physicist, and Bob will be speaking later. So this is just to remind everybody that it is really a radiotherapy team. So in the war effort, radar research led to the incorporation of waveguides to accelerate electrons and allowed the development of linear accelerators, which is what we use today. And the megavoltage era was a mixture of cobalt, which has really now been phased out, and linear accelerators. They gave better depth doses, they spared the skin, no increased bone dose, and it was a revolution in radiotherapy. And deep-seated tumours could now be treated. This is a cobalt unit, and if you can take your eyes away from the shortness of the skirt, you'll see that this is the Theratron 80. It's largely been phased out. And the linear accelerator was largely developed by a guy called Henry Kaplan in San Francisco. And this is the installment, or some pictures of the installment of the first linear accelerator. So this is unloading it in Block 8, as some of you will recall. This is Arthur Cooper, the first director of the QRI. And that's Sir Charles Wanstall, who was a big wheel in the Cancer Fund. This is and now we think this is Sir Edwin Tooth, and after whom this lecture theatre is named. And he was a benefactor, a great benefactor of the hospital. And this must have been shortly before he died, in the year before he died, when he opened up this in 1956. And here's him speaking, Charles Wanstall in the background. Notice all the nurses had their hats on, very good. And this is looking at the linear accelerator. And this is Dr. Keith Mowat, who, who was the second director of the Radium Institute. He was a keen Scotsman and always wore the Mowat tartan tie. In those days, we had windows looking onto the patient. Now it's all done with closed-circuit TV. And one of his classic quotes was, "We don't treat cancer, we treat patients." And I think he was very keen on that. This was the first linear accelerator. You can see how huge it was in conjunction with the RT staff. This was the first operating linear accelerator in Australia in 1956, and we should be very proud that this was a pioneering facet of our work. Not many of you will remember this, but this is the old hospital. This is bringing a patient up the hill to have treatment. You can see that even then Coca-Cola had become rampant in the hospital and was, and this is the old block, I can't remember which block, the old outpatients block anyway, this is dragging patients up the hill to have their treatment. This was the second visit to Ralston Patterson in 1957. That's Patterson, that's his wife, who was also a radiation therapist that's Arthur Cooper, that's Keith Mowat, Claire Faulkner. This is Nobby Bourne, who some of you may know, Arlene Harrison, and Kevin Mead, who was one of the great mentors of the QRI, and Lurleen Parrott. So this is an absolutely classic photograph, and I hope he was very pleased with what he saw. This, in fact, is an article, if we think about 1967, and this is, in fact, Wendy Wood, who went on to become health minister, and I'll show you another picture of her later. This is just to show how crowded the clinics were in those days. This is the 3G clinic, and everybody's wearing a hat, and waiting was just as bad in those days as it is now, I'm afraid, but it was pretty terrible. This is you can see how the landscape of the hospital has changed. This is the excavation site of our third accelerator in 1971. This is Victoria Park, obviously. This is adding the floors to Block 9, and some of you, I think Wendy and Bev, would have worked at those floors there. This is the brand new building. It's now been demolished to make way for QIMR, so landscape and architecture changed pretty rapidly around the hospital. And this is some visiting physicists. This is Hal Gray, after whom the Gray, which is the radiation dose, is named. And this is the old lecture theatre, which some of you may remember. And this is Sir Robert McWhirter from Edinburgh giving a lecture, and we've had many frequent important figures. This was an interesting picture we found. It was in the town, sort of spruiking the advantage of the Radium Institute and get your skin cancer checked. And this was at Walton Sale, and you can see that it was all happening in demonstration of radiation equipment. Now, how many of you remember this? This was a slide rule. And this was the wonders that were worked in those days. This is how we planned it. We took an X-ray, and with Chinograph pens, we delineated what we wanted to treat. And this is the plain X-ray on the accelerator. The treatment was planned with these so-called isodose curves by the radiation therapists and the physicists, and we came up with these plans. But what was amazing in this era was that the ingenuity that the physicists and the workshop evolved. And this was treating a pituitary tumour to doses which are scary even now with 100 Gray, to a tiny lesion to treat pituitary Cushing's. And this was a very clever technique. Long before CTs became available, we stitched lead shot to the temples and took X-rays. This was a retinoblastoma, and we devised a technique to treat that. This is a child. This was a special applicator which is out there if you want to look at it. It shields off the lens, and it was directly measured. And adult lenses are 9 millimeters. This was a 6 millimeter because baby's lenses are 6 millimeters. So we were treating to millimeters of tolerance. And this was the treatment image. And this was the last patient I treated in the early 90s, and she's very well at the age of 26 and working at the university. And this is David Walker, who was one of the physicists at that time, who was one of the pioneers of all this ingenuity. I did show this picture at some other gathering, and some wag in the audience pointed out that all the leaves had gone brown, so it must be a very powerful therapy. And so this is what we had to put up with: fixed beams. This was shielding for Hodgkin's disease. This was the way we delineated the fields, very rough and ready. And this was the sort of clumsy and difficult to manage apparatus we used. And this was very complex in those days, 5-field technique. And so that was one of the annual reports. These are people who put that into practice. Some of you may remember Sid Roberts, Nobby Bourne and Bruce Kynaston, and they were major people in the running of the radiation oncology department then. So the next revolution was intensity modulated radiation therapy. And this is a computer method designing non-uniform fields. It's a dynamic thing. We have multi-leaf collimators which work within the machine, and they sculpt the volume of the dose, and it's automated. And this is the sort of thing, the shape we can devise, any sort of shape we want. And so how to improve the accuracy of radiotherapy? First, we delineate the target, assessing and managing motion, conforming dose around the target, onboard imaging to guide the treatment, and adapting to change through treatment. So the target is not necessarily what we see on the X-ray. This is emerging a PET scan, which is, and this is where our interlinking with our diagnostic colleagues come in. We don't need to treat this. This is collapsed lung. This is the bit we want to treat. So that's the importance of merging. This is even more refined, treating that to a higher dose, that very area there in the prostate. And what about the fourth dimension? And we're treating smaller and smaller fields, and a lot of lung cancers are being diagnosed quite small, but lung cancers move around a lot. And so we need to treat a very small area, but we don't want to treat it if it's bobbed out of the field. So we've now got four-dimensional gating, and we can time the radiation being switched on and off to govern that. So the next step is to design a plan which precisely hits the target but spares normal tissue. So this is what we call an isodose plot of treating an anal cancer. So we give a large dose to the tumour itself. We treat a lower dose perhaps to the important lymph nodes in the groin, but we spare all the normal tissues, the bladder and the genitalia in between. And so the next step is to ensure that the plan is delivered accurately. And so there's no point delivering exquisitely beautiful radiation treatment to the wrong target. And we've always tried to do this, but with increasing sophistication, it's now possible to check each and every field all the way. And this is the sort of way we do that. So each patient's films can be checked each day at all time. The other thing we need to do is to ensure that the plan is delivered accurately. But what if things change? So this is looking at a large lymph node mass from a head and neck cancer. So that's all fine and dandy. We make the plan. As the treatment goes on, let's say about halfway through, it has shrunk. So there's no point, that plan is now irrelevant. So we need to adapt the plan and replan it. So the whole process is a dynamic thing over several weeks. So these are the things we've done, and this is why current treatment, we believe, is so much more sophisticated and non-toxic. We've done this with tomotherapy, and we were the first in Australia to have tomotherapy. This is a novel approach whereby the accelerator whizzes round and the patient moves in and out of this gantry here. And that's enabled us to sculpt, if you like, enormously complex plans of high-dose regions. This is treating a whole scalp, which we have to do quite often for skin cancers. And this is looking at treating the whole of the pleural surface of the lungs. And this is the sort of high degree of sophistication. So we can give a very large dose to a tumour in the brain or the skull and spare the brain stem, we can spare the optic nerve, and we can spare the eye. So this is it evolved a whole new world of things we can properly treat. This is a child's mask for treating a brain tumour with a tomotherapy machine. And this is the sort of sophisticated plan we can deliver to treat a medulloblastoma, high dose here and lower dose right to the spine, but sparing all the normal tissue. And even more refined, we can treat very high doses in single fractions to very small areas. But as we've said, quality assurance is absolutely vital. And one of our Parisian colleagues has said that IMRT without image guidance radiotherapy is IGWT, in God we trust. So there we go. So radiation treatment is a sequential quality assurance. We've got to compare it so each day we make photons to treat patients. And if you compare that with drug treatment, when you prescribe a drug, the QA is done at the manufacturing pharmacy, and you pay for it. And so we've got to ensure that our QA is satisfactory all the way through, and we're daily making photons to treat our patients. So modern techniques give better dose distribution. They rely, however, on technology and less direct monitoring. I must say a word about radionuclides because I wouldn't like to leave you without my thyroid cancer bias. It's monitoring of treatment and treatment of certain cancers, and thyroid cancer is the classic one. This is radioactive iodine, now comes in a capsule. And this is a classic, this is an 18-year-old girl. She had bilateral lung metastases at presentation. She's been successfully treated with radioactive iodine, and 10 years later, she's now had a second child. So this is one tumour we can treat, and there's a whole lot more tumours coming on board with more sophisticated isotopes which we can treat other cancers better, some rare neuroendocrine tumours. I must mention Joyce Twiddell because this takes us back to Changi, and our building is named after Joyce Twiddell, and one of my proudest achievements was getting the building named after her and not some other politician. And she was a nurse who was captured aboard the Vina Brook and was in Changi, and then came back and became the chief radiation therapist. And this is Wendy Edmond, as she then was, and Peter Beattie opening up the Joyce Twiddell building in 2002. It was a very proud moment for all of us. I must mention research and mention the Trans-Tasman Radiation Oncology Group. It was founded 30 years ago in a bar in Taupo, rather inauspicious beginnings, but in the last 30 years it's conducted over 100 trials involving 14,500 patients, and they're all investigator-initiated studies. And so research brings me to two extraordinarily celebrated people who've been involved at the Royal. And the first is Rod Withers, who is one of the most distinguished, or was one of the most distinguished radiation biologists of the last century. He did most of his work, sadly, in the USA, but he was a registrar here. He's received almost every medal you can be awarded, and his work on normal tissue tolerance has absolutely revolutionized the way we think about things. And it was very, I mean, reading, he's such a nice guy. Reading all the obituaries in preparation for this, it was really sad. He died about 3 years ago. But he was unfailingly patient with idiots like me to try and understand the important radiobiological things he was talking about. The other person with enormous influence is Lester Peters, and he was a registrar here. He then went to the UK, and then he became the head of the MD Anderson, which is probably the leading cancer institute in the States. He's published over 300 papers on virtually every aspect of radiotherapy and radiobiology. But he's probably best known for this extraordinary paper, which was published in 2010. It was a trial designed to look at the influence of a new drug in conjunction with radiation therapy. But what they found was that the importance of the quality of the radiotherapy totally swamped any influence of the drug. And there was a clear survival difference between patients who were treated in smaller volume centres where the radiotherapy wasn't as good, and larger centres such as ours where the radiotherapy was good. So this was, if you like, a total justification of our insistence on quality assurance. And this is another quote from Wolfson Patterson saying, what happens if you've got a failure of treatment? So faced with a recurrence, the question, what did I do wrong, is more fruitful than the reflection, oh, bad luck, but after all it was malignant disease. And so I think this is a very worthwhile thing reflecting on. So lastly, I just want to talk about, I alluded to the hospital costs before, but radiotherapy is really very good value. In 1994, I analysed some data from 1982 when we had, and it was easier to pick out the data then, but I worked out that one LINAC gave you 13,720 years of life. And at that stage, it was costing $72.80 a year, or $140 a week. Our business manager kindly adjusted it for CPI, and on those figures, it would be $252 for year of life, or $4.85 a week, about the cost of a double soy latte if you want one. So radiation treatment continues to evolve. We're very sophisticated. It's affirmed its place in cancer care, and it's integral in multidisciplinary management. Importantly, it's not in competition with other therapies, and it requires integration. And nowhere is the integration more extraordinary than in the head and neck clinic. And it's good to see some people from the head and neck clinic here. This array of experts in virtually every field you could think of is on a Friday morning totally focused on giving the best management advice to each individual patient. And it's reflected in the survival figures. And so this is yet another one of the head and neck clinic. Now, we've played a big part in the college, and I'm proudly wearing a College of Radiologists tie. We're intimately linked with our diagnostic colleagues, but Queensland is punched above its weight, and there have been various precedents in the college. The ratio of oncologists to diagnosticians is about 7-1, but nevertheless, Arthur Cooper was president of the college, Nobby Bourne was president of the college, and our glamorous chairman was also the president of the college. So thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thank you so much, Roger. What a treat. I'm hoping there'll be a bit of time for questions at the end. But now it's my pleasure to introduce Bob Fitchew. Bob has actually, and again, if you read the little blurb that's in here, it's such a modest reflection on such a man. Bob is one of Australia's important medical physicists. So much so that we even coined a new term called the Fitchew factor. And how Bob has managed to train not only medical physicists, but so many radiation oncologists in Brisbane and actually across the country. He was principal examiner for our college for many years, setting curricula, training the likes of me and most of my colleagues. He's a very celebrated physicist and has been honoured by the ACPSEM, the Australasian College for Physicists and Engineers in Medicine. And he's also one of the rare breed that's been awarded an honorary fellowship of our college, the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Radiologists, and it hands them out very rarely. And Bob remains the principal physicist for the Royal Medical Physicist at the Royal Brisbane, Deputy Director of Physics Cancer Care. He's sort of retired, but he's actually on a well-deserved long service leave. So it's just a treat to introduce Bob. And 89 years between you, that's just extraordinary. But I first met Bob in my very first year when the whole concept of real physics hit home, which of course is stuff we use every single day. So since 1981. So welcome, Bob.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that very warm introduction. I very much appreciate that. I thought Roger has very well covered pretty much the whole field of radiotherapy history. So I just concentrate on some of the things that happened here at Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. Basically, the theme will be the way in which the advances in technology over time have allowed and contributed to the amazing improvements in radiotherapy that have come about over that time. So I'll be looking at the development, the evolution of treatment machines that are used to treat patients, a similar evolution in parallel with that in brachytherapy. And Roger alluded to the quality assurance that's required. So I thought I'd talk a bit about the quality, improvements in quality assurance that have taken place over the years in the instruments that we're able to use and the way in which that we can actually measure the dose to try to ensure that the doses that are actually delivered to the patient are the doses that appear on those wonderful diagrams that Roger showed. So this is just the overall title of the talk. And we'll start off with external beam treatment machines. They're categorised roughly in those three ways. It's basically by the energy of the X-rays that are produced by the machines. The superficial machines sometimes are subdivided such that the lower end of them is sometimes called contact therapy, and superficial and deep therapy are often grouped together as kilovoltage radiotherapy, and linear accelerators as megavoltage radiotherapy, just as a reference to the energy of the photons that are produced. Obviously, if you want to treat something close to the skin, you use superficial therapy. That doesn't penetrate very far into the skin. The photons get absorbed, and so that spares the underlying tissue. If you want to treat a deep-seated tumour, you need at least to try with deep X-ray therapy, which is more penetrating. And ultimately, of course, as Roger pointed out, linear accelerators completely revolutionised the treatment of deep-seated tumours. The external beam treatment machines we'll start off with are the KV ones, and this shows the Philips contact therapy unit, which was in the radium ward. This was the first one in Australia, so it's interesting. It was in 1937, and it was installed in the radium ward. A couple of years later, an actual facility was built for the external beam treatment machines. But the initial treatments here were for, since in the 1920s, were in the radium ward by radium until we got this contact therapy machine, and even then it was only a low voltage machine. The next two large, or the first two deep therapy machines we got were this Maxima. I'll just go back to the previous one to point out one other thing. The operator of the machine there is Sister Trudell, that Roger talked about in his talk, who of course was very well known, very famous ultimately as the director here. Back again. So this was the next machine, a Maxima. So we're now up to 220 kV. The previous one would have been a maximum of about 60 kV or so. And at about the same time, just a little bit later, a Maxima KV with up to 400 kV now, and this is the maximum we ever had pulsating potential machine in 1939. That was Sister Faulkner, I think, operating the machine in that case. One of the things to note about those machines was they were very big and very cumbersome, which must have made it fairly difficult to apply the treatments to the patients. So when we got our next machine, which is the Maxima, the slide that Roger showed, the X-ray tube is obviously a much more, or the X-ray apparatus is a much more compact, even though it's 250 kV, and manoeuvrable system, which would be much more amenable for the treatment of the patients. We still used contact therapy up until 1973. That was the last of the last contact therapy machine that we had, but they were still very good for treating quite superficial lesions. We then bought Siemens Stabilopans, the machine shown in this one. You can see it's the same general structure as the previous, as the slide before the last one. And these machines were basically the workhorse of deep therapy for quite a long period. You can see the first one in 1960, and the last one was taken out in 2001. So for over a period of about 40 years, a lot of the radiotherapy in Brisbane was done with the Siemens Stabilopan unit, one, two, or three of them. There were three of them. That's a shot of the water window by which the radiographers could look at the patient being treated to make sure they weren't moving during treatment, which of course was quite important. Later on, lead glass windows at enormous expense were used instead in subsequent bunkers. And of course, finally, with the advent of closed-circuit TV, we didn't need windows at all in the heavily shielded treatment rooms, or bunkers as they're conventionally called. Superficial therapy continued over this period, and the corresponding workhorse to the Siemens machine was this Philips Muller RT100, which was used for, again, over a long period, 68 to 2003. And these machines were also installed in a number of centres up and down the coast of Brisbane and out into the countries, because QRI had a Queensland-wide mandate. And so centres were established at about eight different centres: Rockhampton, Maryborough, Cairns, Townsville, Mount Isa, Longreach, Charleville, Roma. And they were equipped with these machines just for treating skin cancers in those places. So this particular machine is probably the one that's treated the most cancers over a long period of time in Queensland. It was replaced by the Galmaith in 2003. This machine now brought in some technological advances. Looking at the previous slides, you may have noticed that there didn't seem to be very much change from the one with Dave Walker in it until the Stabilopan, and also with the superficial therapy machines, there were no great improvements in design. This machine, however, was capable of treating both superficial therapy and deep therapy, so it went up to 300 kV, but a lot of the treatments were done of skin cancers at 100 kV, and it was just a matter of selecting the appropriate applicator to attach to the machine and to find an appropriate filter, because each beam was also had its own individual filter, each particular energy. So it gave us a whole range of energies in the one machine. Another technological advance was that it now incorporated an internal ionisation chamber, and that enabled a much more precise regulation of the dose that was delivered. With the Philips Muller machine, for example, it was necessary to keep the KV, the voltage across the tube, and the current flowing through the tube constant, which meant twiddling dials and going cross-eyed almost in the process as the voltage from the mains varied to keep the output constant, because the way that the dose was regulated was by means of a timer. So there was a certain time calculated to give a certain dose, but of course that dose would only be given if the output was constant throughout the treatment. You might have thought that by now, with all these wonderful advances in in megavoltage therapy with IMRT and the sort of pictures that can be obtained, that deep therapy and superficial therapy might have died out. But our latest machine, which replaces the one I showed in the previous slide, was only installed this year. So we still have a very modern, up-to-date, superficial and deep therapy machine. It provides the same range of energies as the previous one, has a similar corresponding set of applicators to give a great... These are very versatile machines. And it also incorporates a camera, which is a new feature, which shows the patient to the shows an image of the patient continuously during the treatment. So now we come to the megavoltage machines, and the same slide that Roger showed, LA1, and Roger told us a fair bit about that one. It was, of course, a result of the development of linear accelerators, which depended on the ability to produce high energy pulses of microwaves, which came from the radar development in the war. Magnetrons and klystrons were developed for that purpose, but of course were perfect for linear accelerators, and then the development of waveguides that could accelerate electrons using microwaves rather than just a voltage across between two electrodes. I'll point out that there is that long vertical structure that goes right up to the roof and almost down to the patient. That contains the waveguide, and the waveguide, in order to get the energy, was a metre long. But this was a disadvantage because it's nice to be able to rotate the whole structure, that massive gantry, around the patient, and so that the beam can be directed from all sorts of directions. But you can probably see even from that photo that if you go more than a certain angle away from the vertical, it's going to hit the floor. This was partly increased by having a floor that could be recessed downwards in the region there, but this was a big limitation of that machine. However, it was an enormous advance on the deep therapy machines in terms of being able to treat deep-seated tumours because of the vastly higher energy, 4 million volts as opposed to a maximum of 300,000 volts from the deep therapy machines. This shows the control desk for that. I like that slide because it's got analog dials and switches and those sort of things that you don't see very more. So bear that picture in mind, because I'll show you a photo later on of the corresponding control desk for the current accelerators. This is our next accelerator, LA2, and now it got over the problem of not being able to rotate all the way around the patient by mounting the waveguide horizontally. So it's now in that horizontal section, and then you need a bending magnet which bends the beam around so that it still comes down and hits a target and produces X-rays in the direction of the patient. Our next accelerator is the one shown there, and this also has the horizontally mounted waveguide, but this time it has a pretzel magnet, or I'll show in the next slide, that's a cut-off section of it. You can see the section where the electrons are being accelerated, but now they go around in a loop, and this gives you a much more stable beam. So that was the technological advance that machine brought in. This was the acceptance testing of the next accelerator that we bought over in the factory in England. At that stage, it was customary for a physicist to go over and check out the machine. But I showed the slide because it does show you the complexity of what's under the covers in the head of the machine. There's all sorts of electronic components packed in there, and mechanical components. So it's quite a complex machine. So the acceptance testing we went over there, carried out tests. It actually failed the first test, and I came home, went back again later. It passed the second one, so everything was fine, and what could possibly go wrong? It was then shipped out to Brisbane, and when we took it out of the shipping container, this is what we found. So it just shows you things can go wrong. And consequently, there was a big clean-up effort to restore it to its pristine original state, which took several months. Obviously, the container wasn't quite watertight, and a bit of seawater got in. So this is the machine itself. I show that slide because those guys are the X-ray engineers, the hospital employed X-ray engineers to look after our equipment, and they did a great job of keeping it operating. So they're also part of the overall team that deserve an accolade in terms of the being able to deliver the treatments that we do. One of the major technological advance in that machine, in LA4, was that as well as producing these high energy beams of photons, it also produced beams of electrons. So if you take the target out of the way, where the electrons come down and bang into a target and produce X-rays, take it out of the way and instead put in just a scattering foil, then you get a beam of electrons. Now, electrons are absorbed in tissue in a quite different fashion to X-rays. So just looking at the left-hand side of the screen of the picture, that's an isodose curve just showing how the dose falls off with depth in water. And you can see that it's fairly constant over quite a distance, and then over quite a short distance, it rapidly falls off to almost no dose at all. On the other hand, the megavoltage photon beam on the right, you can see that there's just a gradual decrease in dose as you go down in water. So the big advantage of electrons was that if you just want to treat a deep-seated tumour, a relatively superficial tumour, and spare the tissues lying beyond it, then this gives you this additional capability with the advent of electrons. The picture is just a dosimetry film, which basically illustrates the same thing as the isodose curves. Isodose curves like that could be produced from a densitometer, using a densitometer from the dosimetry films. One of the a new treatment technique then that this made possible, the advent of electrons, was the dosimetry. What was a treatment for mycosis fungoides, where the aim is just to treat down to around about 1 centimetre below the surface of the skin, but to the whole body. We can see from these pictures, which are taken in the anthropomorphic phantom that I'll talk a little bit about later, we ended up with, you can see that that's achieved fairly well. There's very little dose to the whole of the body, but nevertheless a rind of dose all around the skin area and just below it. And an isodose diagram that has been derived from that film. And that shows the patient in position. In order to get dose all the way around the patient actually has to stand in 6 different positions, facing 60 degrees apart, away each time, over a treatment cycle. So by using 6 different orientations of the patient, we can get that uniform dose around the patient. Our next machine was this Varian Clinac 4100. This one gave us a 4MV machine. So the little 2 means it's a replacement. So it replaced both LA1 and LA2 that we've already talked about. And the interesting feature of this machine, since it was just an X-ray only machine, was that it went back to a standing wave, to a waveguide, which again was vertically mounted. So this time the waveguide's not in the horizontal part of the gantry structure, but it just points straight down. This was because the technological development was the development of a very short standing waveguide, which could, in a third of the length, produce the same energy of electrons at the end of it when it accelerates the electrons. That made it much more simple, and you don't have a bending magnet anymore, and presumably gave the manufacturers a competitive advantage when we went to tender again for these replacement machines. Our next, the next machine we had was the Varian Clinac 1800. It now also produced electrons, but again with an extended range. The previous one had a maximum, you may have noticed, 13 MeV. This one went up to 18 MeV and with 6 MV photons. Our next machine was the Philips SL20, again, which produced a large range of electrons, and the one after that, and one that was installed, that we bought 4 of, because at this point we had the new Joyce Trudell building. The radiation therapy facility moved right across the campus from Hurston Road right across to the other side of the campus, and in the process we had to equip it with new accelerators. This is the model of accelerator that was used for that purpose. I'll just go on a bit, I think. Later, those machines were ultimately replaced also with this, which is the current machine, the Varian Clinac IX. They've replaced LAs 1, 2 and 4. LA5 got replaced by the tomotherapy machine, the first tomotherapy machine that Roger mentioned. And this machine produced both 6 and 10 MV X-rays, so we now have a choice of greater X-rays, another technological development, another energy and a more penetrating beam still. That was also the case, I should have pointed out, I guess, with the Electa Precise. It was also 6 and 10 MeV, and the Philips SL20. So it was at that point that we got the dual energy availability, which gives the oncologist a greater choice in the particular beam to be used to treat the patient. Particular energy can be suited to the patient better. The current machines have similar energies, 6 to 18 MeV electrons, 6 and 10 MV photons, but you may notice at the sides of the machine now, there's a whole lot of hangers-on. And this is the onboard imaging. So that incorporates a diagnostic type X-ray imaging, X-ray tube and producing X-rays. And on the other side of the machine, a detector which measures which forms an image of what's an X-ray image of the patient. So that can be used, as Roger pointed out, in making sure that the patient is in the right position for the treatment, during the treatment and just before the treatment. And by comparing the X-ray image that you get from the onboard imaging system with the corresponding images that were produced in the planning process. A Roger pointed out about the multi-leaf collimators and showed you those things. That actually shows one in the linear accelerator itself. The multi-leaf collimator basically came about by splitting up instead of just having jaws, which were heavy lead blocks delineating the field in the accelerator head, by then splitting up one set of jaws, one pair of jaws, into individually motorised and driven components or leaves. So they're the multi-leaf collimator, which has the dual purposes of allowing you very easily now to produce irregular fields rather than having to make heavy lead shielding blocks which go on a shadow tray, but also enables the amazing IMRT, the intensity modulated radiotherapy that is available now. Without the multi-leaf collimator, that wouldn't be possible. And there's the control desk for the current Linac, so it's changed a little bit from the one that I showed you with LA1. The tomotherapy unit Roger alluded to, we have two of those. They perform a similar function to the current accelerators in that they can produce intensity modulated radiotherapy or the equivalent of that, and they also can produce images of the patient just prior to setup, just prior to treatment, using this time the megavoltage beam itself. So you can check the patient positioning in the tomotherapy machine just in the machine itself. Roger showed this slide, and it's almost self-explanatory in that the X-ray machine, it's still a small linear accelerator producing X-rays. It rotates around the patient, and at the same time as it rotates about it, the couch rotates, or translates rather, so that a section of the patient, a certain length of the patient, is irradiated. And as the accelerator part moves around, a multi-leaf collimator keeps changing the amount of or the shape of the radiation that's coming out, and the overall result is the amazing dose distributions that Roger had shown us. I'll just mention some treatment accessories. Roger showed that slide because, again, one of the big advantages we had in QRI, in Division of Oncology and Cancer Care Services, as the name changed, was the ability to have made in a mechanical workshop, which belonged to us, quite intricate devices. So this is a shadow tray. You can see some lead blocks on it. This one's actually a triple-decker one, so it would enable quite a lot of modification of the beam. And the workshop was able to manufacture all sorts of treatment accessories just on demand to enable a better treatment of the patient, a more precise treatment of the patient. This is one of their products, a logarithmic profile wedge, of which there is a copy, which there's a sample out on the table at the back. This is just a wedge that was designed by Dave Walker, in fact, to modify the beam in a certain way, which was very useful for particular treatments. The pituitary, that's the pituitary applicator that was used for those pituitary treatments that Roger alluded to. And again, this was made in the mechanical workshop. That hole in the centre is actually a conical hole that goes through that applicator. So it required quite clever engineering in the mechanical workshop. Another form of treatment accessory was devices called shells, which you can see in the front of the picture there, which we use to immobilise the patient, because it's necessary that the patient stays in the correct position for the treatment. Otherwise, as Roger pointed out, if you treat the wrong part of the patient, it's not going to be very successful. So the shell making machine was acquired in 1996. To make the shells, a plaster cast was first made of the patient, and then in the machine a transparent shell, transparent plastic shell was formed over the plaster cast, and then that was, as shown in the next patient, put over the slide, put over the patient to immobilise them. We now go on to brachytherapy and what happens there. And as an example, I looked at the treatments of cancer of the cervix, which, as Roger said, was one of the main applications of brachytherapy, because you could put radioactive sources around the cervix area in the patient. And these are the same slide I think Roger just showed of the original Manchester tandem and ovoids, which used radium. They were here eventually superseded by this Fitchew suit Delcos applicator, which was manually afterloaded with cesium tubes. What that means is that the applicators are put in the patient, and then inserts shown at the right-hand side of the slide which contained cesium tubes now rather than radium tubes, which were thinner and so more amenable to this geometry, were later afterloaded into the hollow applicators when the patient had gone back to the ward after the theatre session. So this had the advantage of removing the dose that the staff received with the preloaded radium treatments, as indicated by the previous slide, but it didn't get over the problem of the dose to the nurses, who were looking after the patients for up to several days while they had these applicators with cesium sources in them in place. But nevertheless, this was a technological advance. It meant that the radiation oncologist doing the insert could take as much time as they liked to get it right, and also the shape of the applicators ensured a more uniform geometry and more reproducible geometry than with the tandem and ovoids. However, the problem of dose to everybody was solved with the invention of the afterloading systems, or the commercialisation of remote afterloading systems, I should say. This is the Neutron Selectron, which is the machine which does that. It incorporates a tiny source of iridium-192 now, but a very powerful source, extremely powerful, on the end of a long cable. And under computer control, that source can be driven into applicators which have been placed in the patient. This gets over, because all this is done in a shielded room. No staff get any dose from it, but it also, because of the ability to move the little radioactive source to different positions within the applicator, enables the dose to be much better conformed to the target volume. I might point out that also that the target volume initially was not really well known until the advent of CT, so that standard combinations of radium sources in tubes and ovoids were used. With the advent of CT, it was possible to see where the target region was, and then to produce a much more conformal dose to it with the microselectron. And those are the tandem navoids that it uses, or the development from them. So they connected up to the machine, as will be shown in the next slide. And once again, you do have the advantage of a reproducible geometry. That shows the cable. This is actually a check cable, because we wouldn't want to be trying to take a picture of one with that source in it. But at the left-hand side of the picture, you can maybe see the little tip. That's the source. It's on the end of a cable. It's about 1.5 meters long. And that's the source capsule. The actual source itself is within that, but it just shows you how small it is, which enables it to be driven through quite thin tubes and into the applicators. And so that's what it looks like when a patient's being treated. That's actually breast treatment, but a similar arrangement occurs with this electron. And once again, only this year, we have replaced the microselectrons with the GammaMed remote afterloader, which basically does the same job. Brachytherapy, I'll just take another example of the treatment of skin cancer. It uses, this time, not radium directly, although the early slides did show that for a long time radium was used for treating skin cancer. In fact, here it was the only method until the first X-ray tube was obtained. This just shows a part of the radon plant that was used. At the right-hand side of the slide are flasks. In those flasks are solutions of radium. As radium decays, it produces radon, and the end product of the plant is radon seeds, which is radon gas encapsulated in little gold seeds. And a way of using those seeds to treat skin cancer is by putting them on little plastic discs like that, called radon molds, strapping them onto the patient, leaving them there for a period, about 5 days, taking them off again, and that's the treatment. This was a very useful treatment for the decentralised ambit of the Radium Institute, because we were able to take drums of radon seeds, drums containing the drums because of shielding requirements, to all of the sub-centres, make up moulds on the spot, put them on the patients, tell the patients after 5 days, take them off and put them in a tin away from where you are, and we'll collect them on our next visit. So an oncologist and a physicist used to go and perform these treatments. Sometimes it was very busy. I remember on one occasion we were rushing to try to get the plane to the next centre and trying to finish off all the patients that were waiting for their moulds. It turned out that when we put on the last mould, we only just had a tiny short time to get to the plane before it was due to take off. So we put the radon in the back of the patient's car. He drove us to the airport. The plane was waiting on the tarmac, had already taken up the steps on which you get on, and was about to take off. So we rushed onto the tarmac, waving our arms, and they let down the steps again, let us get on, and we managed to get to the next centre. So it was quite exciting times, those country trips. Another application is interstitial needles, which I just mentioned briefly. These are called the afterloaded radon needles. Again, the aim is to put inactive hollow needles in the patient and then afterload them again with just an insert which was thinner but contained the radon seeds. And we're credited with being one of the originators of this technique in the world. It was published in a paper by Dr. Mowat and Keith Stevens, a physicist. Eventually the radon lab closed, and so we didn't produce radon anymore, but we were then able to continue implants using iridium wire. which was produced at the Lucas Heiss reactor down in Sydney. It does the similar job, and there was a similar afterloading system for use with that. And I'll just mention one other application of brachytherapy because it was unique to RBH. And this was a tongue implant. Those are radon seeds inside the circular-looking plastic tubing that are going around the tongue. So there's a tumour on the side of the tongue, and it's being completely surrounded by those seed chains, as they were called. And this delivered a much better dose distribution to that than you could get with just, say, what was the standard treatment was to use radium needles. Or if it had been here, you could have used just an array of implanted radon needles. But this gave a much better because the tumour was being irradiated from all sides simultaneously by all the seeds. I just mentioned planning. Roger mentioned that the amazing advances in planning that have taken place, but that's a simulator which was used to take the X-ray pictures, like Roger showed, in the planning process. And once again, you end up with a radiograph like that on which the oncologist marks the field they want to treat. But we still have to work out how to apply that to the patient and what dose to give, or not what dose to give, but how to give the prescribed dose. And so this shows the process very quickly. That's one of our radiographers, Reece Betts, is the model in this particular case. So a lead strip was used to get an outline of the patient, transferred to paper. 3 field. It was the oncologist prescribed 3 fields, so that was the way it was to be done. And then, with the aid of isodose charts, and that's just an example, but Roger showed some of those as well. And with no more computing power than the slide rule that Roger showed, these isodose diagrams were produced, showing the variation of dose throughout the region. I might point out, though, that this was still a fairly crude way of, apart from the inaccuracies in the outline and in the actual computation of the dose, which was done by overlaying isodose charts and coming up with a diagram like that. It was all assumed that the patient was composed entirely of water, so that the effect of the lung wasn't really taken into account in those early days. And that shows the patient set up for treatment then from a plan like that. So the next big technological advance was the advent of planning computers. That was actually our second commercial planning computer, the GERT plan in 1984. These used algorithms to produce treatment plans, so they came up with much more accurate plans. The plans were based now on CT outlines, so you didn't need lead strips anymore, and that made the whole process much more accurate, and they could take into account the variation in density within the patient as well. So you ended up with considerably more accurate plans. Over time, the sophistication of the planning algorithms increased enormously, and so the ones today are really very good. But this is the sort of picture that was presented, or from a dose plan with RT plan. So we'll now go to quality assurance. What we're looking at there is an anthropomorphic phantom. That's the one on the right. The anthropomorphic phantom was designed to enable measurements to be made in something that was more human-like, or more patient-like rather, than just a tank of water, where previously most measurements had been, where most measurements of dose were made. So it consists of, it's made essentially of tissue equivalent material, but it incorporates a real human skeleton, and it incorporates tissue equivalent lungs and some cavities, as you can also see in the slice that I'm holding. It's sliced in inch-thick slices as you go down, so that you can put dosimeters, and they're the little white dots that you can see in the lung region of that radiograph that I'm holding. That's a radiograph of that particular section. And so the idea is that you can, if you want to test a particular technique and see whether when you deliver it you get the right dose, you plan the technique for this patient, for the phantom, irradiate it, and then measure the dose wherever you want to measure it, using little dosimeters called thermoluminescent dosimeters that were placed in little holes in the slices. So we'll now go back to, that was just an introductory slide. We'll go back to the start, and this is a very early form of radiation measuring device, a Röntgen radiometer. The idea of this is that you could measure the dose from an X-ray machine by irradiating a little disc which had been impregnated with a salt that changed colour with the radiation, and depending on the amount of change of colour, you had a measure of the dose. And so you did that and then matched it to the colour on this colour wheel, which you could turn. It says 7 there, and that would correspond to a certain dose. There'd be a different colour at 6 and so on. So that little device is also out on the table if you want to have a look at it. But anyway, eventually the standard method of measuring radiation was with an ionisation chamber, and this is an early ionisation chamber that was used. The ionisation chamber is shown attached to the machine at the front and in front of the machine itself, just standing in its holder. So to make a measurement, you had to go into the treatment room, place the holder, run out of the treatment room, irradiate the holder, go back in, get the chamber and put it back on the reader and see by how much radiation had been given, was the general process. And if you want to make measurements in a number of different parts of the beam, then you had to do that many times. So physicists had to be very fit in those days. That problem was solved with the Baldwin Farmer dosimeter, where now we have the ion chamber connected to the electrometer, to the device which reads the machine, which reads the dose, so that you don't have to go in and out of the room for successive exposures. This is the corresponding current electrometer to the Baldwin Farmer chamber. Just the way that measurements were made was with an ion chamber for just a check measurement of the output of the machine in a jig like that. If it's electrons, the one on the right. To make measurements in something more than just one point in air, a water phantom was used. This is a homemade one that was developed here. They were eventually superseded by, or we bought a commercial one which had a lot more flexibility and features that whereby the chamber in the water can be moved around in a programmed way to produce the data that's required. There's the anthropomorphic phantom that I mentioned earlier, so I needn't go into that again. And again, parts of that are on the table outside if you want to have a look at it. With the advent of IMRT, or even before that, phantoms which would allow ion chamber dosimetry under various conditions were developed, and this is our thorax phantom. where ion chambers can be placed in any of those positions where there are bits sticking out. With the advent of IMRT, intensity modulated radiotherapy, it's more difficult to measure the dose, and so you need more elaborate phantoms. This is what's called the cheese phantom, which is used for every IMRT patient on the in the in the tomotherapy suites. And a recent addition is the Octavius phantom, which now has 729 detectors inside, so that in a single radiation of IMRT we can get the whole dose distribution and compare it with the plan to make sure that the plan is okay. Also a dynamic phantom to check the gating mechanism that is operating correctly, giving the right dose. Roger mentioned that for cases where there's movement in the patient. And a well-type ion chamber for brachytherapy. So that's the special chamber that's used for the brachytherapy sources. The brief we were given said we were going to tell you all about the future of radiotherapy, and since I don't have a crystal ball, I just mention one thing, and that is that protons, as Roger mentioned, are possibly the next big thing in radiotherapy. We are looking at the possibility of getting a proton therapy machine. The advantage of that is shown in this slide, which shows how the dose varies with depth for a couple of different situations. You can see the 10 MV photon labelled curve. That's our most energetic photon curve. But you can see how the dose falls off fairly slowly with depth, and so you're always going to be irradiating tissue beyond where your tumour is. If the tumour is in the part where the red line is between the 100% lines on the graph. But with protons, you get what's called a Bragg peak, and with just one energy of photons, you get a Bragg peak that looks like just that blue line, and also any of the other little blue lines. That's the dose distribution you get. So you get low dose up until a certain point, but then a lot of dose at the Bragg peak. By combining a number of Bragg peaks, that is beams by varying the energy of the beam taking another shot, you can end up with the distribution shown with the red line, where, as you can see, you get a uniform dose, which would be in the region of the tumour, but virtually no dose at all. A very rapid fall off, even much more rapid than with electrons at the end of that, and and still less dose on the entrance side until you get to the tumour region. So in general, with protons, you can get better dose distributions than you can get with megavoltage photons, even with the amazing IMRT and VMAT techniques. So this is just a slide of a proton therapy facility, and it's enormously expensive, and also has a number of radiation protection problems associated with it. But there so far isn't one operating in Australia, but as far as I know, but a number of centres are in the process of acquiring one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. And I hope that, by the end of the evening, you sort of get an appreciation for what an extraordinary I guess, sequence of events have actually led us to this evening and where we are today and on this campus and radiotherapy around the world. And, you know, Roger and Bob just exemplify the knowledge, the wisdom that's required in amongst all of this incredible technology. But it's taken decades and decades of work with physicians, with physicists, with scientists, with industry, with engineers. It's taken all the advances in imaging, which have revolutionized what we do and the computing capacity. I think that it's fair to say that the next evolution into protons, is what might appear to be expensive, but at the end of the day, we cannot forget that radiation treatment is unbelievably cheap. It's unbelievably effective. We contribute 40% to cure. And next to our expenditure on drugs, we are just but a babe in the water. So I think that it behoves me to thank Bob and Roger from the bottom of our hearts. The team at the Royal it's a big team. It's incredibly devoted to delivering the best care that we can. It's a very integrated part of cancer care, but the team within radiation oncology, very, very exacting, very experienced, very sophisticated, an absolute privilege to work with them. And to have had not just the history but the reminiscing of Bob and Roger tonight has been an absolute privilege. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I particularly want to thank our sponsors again, and particularly Bruce Jones, director of QBank, who's been such a prominent sponsor of the alumni. And of course the lovely Amy, who just organises everything so unbelievably well. So on that, I might hand over to you, Cliff. And before I do, we've got a bottle of wine for both of our speakers. Now, I have to say, the best poster I ever saw at a radiation research meeting was about the beneficial impact of red wine on the background effect of the radioactive planet on which we live. And it took about 2 glasses minimum of red wine for men and at least 1 glass of red wine for women per day to negate the background effect of radiation, which you heard as you walked in the door. So thank you both, gentlemen.
That didn't happen in surgery. That never happened in surgical training. Look, it just remains for me to thank both our speakers for this tremendous history that we have had and so many achievements here at Royal Brisbane, first in the country, and this continues with the current leadership and the treatment. But I'd also like to thank Liz for being a brilliant MC and also for her ongoing leadership in radiation oncology, both to all the people of Queensland and this hospital. Thank you, Liz, and a bottle of wine for you as well. Thank you. Very great time. Thank you very much.
That's it. It's great.
Beautiful. Yeah. Oh yeah, totally. Bye. Are you off?